All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Local Government Insights Podcast, Modernizing Government Leadership, your source and insight for local government technology. My name is Brendan Middleton, and today we have with us Tim Casey, a veteran city manager and author of the book, The Mayor Married Who? A look at the lighter side of a 40-year career in city management. Welcome to the show, Tim. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Brendan. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Right before we jump in, for those listening, Tim started his career in city management as an intern for the Manhattan Beach city manager in California. From there, he worked in the city manager's office in the city of Ventura, then rose to the position of assistant city manager in Redondo Beach, which eventually led to the position of city manager there. From Redondo Beach, Tim went on to serve as the first city manager for the city of Laguna Niguel, where he served for over 22 years before retiring. Tim currently serves as Orange County Senior Advisor for ICMA and League of California Cities. We'll touch on some specifics around ICMA a bit later, but we're very fortunate, Tim, to spend a few minutes with you. I'm really excited to tap into your experience in city management and your wisdom, but also dive into some of the specifics around the book, The Mayor Married Who, and why you wrote that, and what led to some of the stories that you put in there. So let's just jump right to it. So the most obvious question, The Mayor Married Who? What led you to write the book, Tim? And could you give us some brief highlights on the story behind why you wrote it?
I'd be happy to. Shortly after coming to Laguna Niguel in 1990, I was asked to serve on a panel at one of the annual California city manager meetings. The title of the panel was Fabulous Flops, and we were asked to share stories about maybe a great idea that just didn't quite work out. My particular story had to do with a traffic violator school that we had created in the city of Redondo Beach. We had heard that the local judges were not particularly happy with the private school operators, so we thought, well, let's start a municipal traffic violator school. We'll offer the course for 8 hours a day on a Sunday in the Saturday in the council chambers. We'll have the instructors be the same motor deputies and motor officers that wrote you your ticket, kind of get them out of their uniform and put them behind a coat and tie. And things were going well. We were probably serving about 50 people a week. We were netting about $2,000 a week in net revenue. And after about a year, we got an ominous letter from the California Department of Motor Vehicles telling us it was a cease and desist order because we were operating an illegal traffic violator school without a license. So we set out to get a license, found out that state law didn't really allow cities to run traffic violator schools. So we set out to change state law and got absolutely clobbered in Sacramento by the lobbyists for all the private traffic school operators. So we quietly shut down shop. And to this day, I think it was a great idea that just absolutely didn't work. At the end of the panel, some other city manager came up and said, that was a great story. If you have any more, you ought to write a book. And that led me to start making notes going back to the very beginning of my career up until the final month in Laguna Niguel. And when COVID hit, I stopped playing golf and converted my green fees into publishing fees and cranked out the book in about 6 weeks or so.
I love that. And clearly there are some real stories and takeaways in a lot of the stories that you've put in the book, but you also have a bunch of funny and insightful stories in the book, much like the one you just mentioned, which was real, but also there's kind of a funny side of how it all played out. One of which I want to touch on because I think it was super interesting. We discussed it in our pre-interview, but when I read this one, I knew I had to ask about it. One of the experiences you had when you were the city manager's intern at Manhattan Beach. My thought was like, what happened back then, and what can the takeaway be? What can government leaders and professionals learn from that story as you tell us about it?
Oh, great. Well, I had the privilege of serving a great city manager, Gail Martin, for 2 years as a management intern in Manhattan Beach, California. He was known for giving substantial assignments to his interns. And my first assignment was to work with a senior civil engineer from the Public Works Department and look into the pros and cons of private refuse collection versus municipal refuse collection. The city for years had contracted with a reputable local private contractor, but the new city council wanted us to take a look at the feasibility of starting a city operation. Spent about 6 months conversing with other Southern California cities and their refuse superintendents, tried to glean as much information as we could from the then private contractor. At the conclusion of our research, we made a strong recommendation to the city council that we ought to continue to contract out that service. We should not go into the business ourselves. There were many benefits of private refuse collection, including the opportunity to go out to bid every 5 to 7 years, keep the prices competitive, know that it was a responsibility of a private business to pick up the trash and dispose of it properly. And there are a lot of good reasons not to go into the city business, not the least of which was, like the mail service, the trash must be picked up come sun, rain, or hail. And if you happen to have a day when an unusual number of people called in sick, you'd have to basically cannibalize other public works operations to get people onto the trucks. So I was tasked to give that staff presentation. It was the first public presentation of my career. At the conclusion, one of the council members said, "I've been on the council for many, many years, and that's probably the best staff report and the best public presentation I have ever experienced." Then they voted 5-0 to totally ignore our recommendation and send us into the municipal trash collection business. So I guess the lesson learned there was that sometimes the very best and most thoughtful administrative research that goes into a recommendation may not carry the day with the city council. And at the end of the day, it is the duty of the city manager to implement those final decisions to the best of his or her ability, even if they weren't the course of action that you recommended. And I think that's a good lesson for any current or prospective city manager. You carry out the will of the council professionally, effectively, to the best of your ability, even if you don't disagree with their decision.
Excellent. And speaking of lessons learned, Tim, I love that thread because I want to talk about some of the not so positive outcomes you had to deal with over your career for just a few minutes. Nowadays, it's obviously very rare for public officials to admit that they made a big mistake on the job. But in the book specifically, you in fact admit to 2 rather large mistakes that you made as a city manager, both of which you describe in your own words as, if you got fired, you thought it would have been justified. So could you talk about those 2 instances specifically, and just some of the lessons that you learned from that, and some of the takeaways that some others, that local leaders or any sort of department head for any local government could take away from that lesson?
Sure. As painful as they are, the first one actually occurred in Redondo Beach. Redondo Beach is a coastal community, actually, many miles of sandy beaches and a fully developed harbor and marina. So we happen to have an old, dilapidated shopping center close to the waterfront, and we had watched the private sector try without success to redevelop it over the course of many, many years. The challenge was that there were about 13 or 14 individual businesses who owned the land that their structure sat on, but they all owned the parking lot in common. And the private sector just couldn't get everybody to agree at the same time to sell at a reasonable price. So after hearing outcries from the community, we decided to use our redevelopment powers to condemn the property, go through the process of acquisition with an eye toward ultimately selling the property to a hotel developer. Interestingly, we had the property appraised at $5 million. We found a hotel developer who would agree to pay a purchase price of up to $6.25 million. So we thought we had our bases covered. In California, you can actually take possession of a redevelopment property before the purchase is finalized. So we began the process of taking immediate possession. along the way, the property owners went out and engaged the services of one of the better known condemnation defense attorneys in the state. And when we were unable to reach agreement on a purchase price, we ended up in court where a jury would ultimately tell us what the property was worth. The attorney somehow managed to convince the jury that our property was of the same caliber as a bluff top undeveloped property in Orange County that became the site of a Ritz-Carlton hotel. Our property was next to a power plant across the street from an asphalt parking lot, not directly on the ocean. And unfortunately, the jury decided that the property that we thought was worth $5 million was worth $10 million. The developer was on the hook for, as I mentioned, $6.25 million, and I had to scramble to find $3.75 million in the middle of the fiscal year to complete the purchase. We managed to do it, but we were so far off the mark with that appraisal and so far off the mark in terms of our judgment of what a jury might award that I felt that if they sent me packing on that one, I probably deserved it. The other one occurred in Laguna Niguel, probably about 3 or 4 years after I got here. To be honest, starting a new city from scratch, you probably can't pay attention to everything all the time. We had an experienced finance director. We had about $21 million invested in some local government investment pools, really not paying a whole lot of attention to that until a local certified public accountant challenged the long-term county treasurer for election, and along the way began talking about what he thought were some of the more risky, inappropriate investments that the Orange County treasurer had localities involved with. We had $18 million in the Orange County investment pool. We had $3 million in the state local government investment pool, and something just told me that we had too many eggs in too few baskets. So the finance director and I set out to diversify the portfolio. We made arrangements on December 5th of 1994 to reduce our exposure in the Orange County pool from 18 million down to 7 million, increase our exposure in the state pool, and then buy $7 million of treasury bills. The day before, the afternoon before, Orange County declared bankruptcy as its investment pool collapsed, and we had $18 million frozen for, we didn't know how long it would be. At the end of the day, the county put together a recovery plan, but everybody took a haircut, and we ended up losing $900,000 on my watch. Once again, I felt if the council said, here's the door, it would have been justified. And I think what saved me on that one was that the county treasurer had been keeping 2 sets of books, the one that had the real investments documented and the one that he put out to all of the nearly 200 local agencies in the county investment pool, which portrayed a completely different picture. So I guess the lesson learned there is that you never know when something like that is going to come up. You still try to do the best that you can, but not everything works out as planned. And again, if I'd been given the pink slip, I would have walked away with my tail between my legs and feeling like time to look for the next new position.
Well, Tim, I appreciate you sharing those stories, because I know there are a lot of positive outcomes and a lot of funny instances in which you sort of frame the book around. But I personally take away just as much from the positive and the good outcomes as the not so good ones. And I think there's always lessons to be learned, and others that listen to this show can also probably empathize with some of those specific examples that you gave, and can also relate probably in some form or fashion. So I appreciate you sharing that. Given the highs and lows of city management, I want to spend just a minute, and we can talk stories all day. I want to present the idea of anyone thinking of becoming a city manager, particularly someone who is already an assistant city manager or even just a department head, what strategic advice would you give them to land or win a position like that? Because as you know, they're super hard to come by. They're not always readily available in any given area of the country, but most certainly hard to keep. So what advice would you give for someone looking to move into the city manager role?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. The first is that I was lucky enough to spend a career in city manager offices. I never worked in an operating department. I was always on the city manager's staff. But even then, I felt like as an intern, I needed to put myself out there and request opportunities to do things that I thought would be valuable in the future. So, for example, even as a part-time management intern, I asked if I could sit in on labor negotiations, even be the note keeper for the management negotiating team. If I saw opportunities in other departments, maybe the police chief needed a short-term project manager to take a look at some particular issue, the pros and cons of municipal jails versus sending your trustees to the county jail. I always looked for opportunities to volunteer as opposed to waiting for people to give me assignments. And that another one comes to mind. Back in the old days, before we had the advantage of all of this technological capability, the cities in the South Bay area of Los Angeles County used to do an annual total compensation survey. It was a pencil and paper exercise where someone had to volunteer to actually go to 13 cities, speak with their personnel or HR managers, get compensation data for certain benchmark classifications. I begged for that opportunity, not only to learn more about personnel and human resources, but to also get myself out in front of 13 other city managers, HR directors, and personnel directors when I was beginning my career. And that actually ultimately led to my return to Redondo Beach after my stint in Ventura. I think the other thing is to kind of identify your own strengths and weaknesses. And for example, as a very young city manager in Redondo Beach, I realized that I had never had a class in municipal accounting. I knew that as the head of the redevelopment agency, I needed to learn more about real estate and development economics and finance so that I could represent the city well in face-to-face negotiations with a developer. And so went back at night and took some graduate courses at UCLA just to keep, I guess, developing new skills that I really had not had exposure to or refining the skills that I did. But I think getting out there and just volunteering whenever possible to be a part of a project team or a task force, or just to grab those plum assignments before somebody else does is good preparation for anybody seeking to move up into city management.
I love that. And the key ones I found even in my own career, I think some of the feedback and the examples and advice that you gave for city management actually applies to just business in general. I mean, you are running a business, for example, as a city manager, even though it is a city, it runs like a business with all its functional units. And just continuous improvement and willing to raise your hand for projects that you may or may not be skilled at initially, but figuring out a way to identify problems and challenges and solutions that meet those problems. And then just constantly willing to innovate and change and understand that the economy and business in general is constantly changing, and you have to be willing to change along with it as you go throughout your career. And I think those are good qualities that really any leader can take away from your example. So thank you for sharing that, Tim.
You bet.
Next, just for a brief few minutes, I do want to touch on your involvement with ICMA briefly. I mentioned in the opening that you currently serve as Orange County Senior Advisor for ICMA and the League of Californias, but more specifically for ICMA. And for those close to the industry, you know what ICMA is, but briefly, ICMA stands for International City and County Management Association, and it's a professional association representing local government management professionals worldwide. ICMA brings training, networking opportunities, and resources to support, the professional development of all of its members. I want to touch on the ICMA's Range Rider program, if you have a few minutes. Could you talk about your involvement there and what that is?
Yeah, sure, be happy to. So the Range Rider program actually originated in California, I think back in the late 1970s. There was a highly respected longtime city manager named Wes McClure, who had been the manager of San Leandro, California for many, many, many years. And upon his retirement, he felt that his own skills and his knowledge and his experiences were not being fully utilized. So he came up with the idea that perhaps there should be a group of retired city managers and county executives who represent a particular geographic region of the state and make themselves available as a volunteer coach, mentor, advisor to other active practitioners. Ultimately, ICMA adopted the program nationally. I think there are 15 or 20 states that currently have range riders, now called senior advisors. And for the past 10 years since I retired, it's been my privilege to serve as the senior advisor to the 34 Orange County cities and city managers here in California. We make ourselves available as a personal and professional resource to any manager in need. We typically attend our area manager meetings, which are often held on a monthly basis. We go to the annual City Managers Conference, where we actually meet with our other range riders in the state. And we also go to the ICMA National Conference, where there is a national range riders meeting. So next month will be my 10-year milestone, and it's been a good way to stay connected to the profession and to the professionals that I have known or gotten to know over the past 40 years.
That's fantastic. And hopefully I plan to be there at the National ICMA Conference this year, and hopefully we can meet up, and I'd love to meet you in person. With that role, though, and thank you for that background, with the role you're in as an advisor, you obviously speak to a lot of different city managers who deal with a lot of diverse challenges given their particular city makeup or area or geographical representation. But could you pull to the surface maybe some of the most common problems that you see a lot of cities faced with over the last, let's say, couple of years, maybe? What are the big trends you're seeing in city management?
Well, the first one that comes to mind certainly has been, the burden placed on city managers and city executives to get through the COVID crisis. I mean, literally, managers had to transform the way that services are delivered. City halls were shuttered. Council meetings became virtual. Managers were at the forefront trying to figure out a way to kind of keep the democratic process alive when you couldn't meet face to face with constituents, customers. And I think that has taken something of a burden. We're just coming out of it right now. In fact, here in Orange County, there are some cities that are in the process of reversing some of the creative ways that public input was permitted during the last 3 years, much to the chagrin, actually, of some members of the public who say, wait a minute, you made it so easy for us to participate virtually in city council meetings and to Zoom in or call in live while the council was in session. Some folks are rolling that back now, and they're getting some pushback. But I think COVID was a challenge just to keep our cities operating and to keep our democracies running. More specifically in California, we've seen cities grappling with affordable housing issues, homelessness, sober living homes. The state seems to have been encroaching more and more into the local zoning process, and in some cases mandating the inclusion of multi-family residential uses and recovery homes for addicts in the middle of beautiful single-family neighborhoods. That's been a real challenge. It seems like probably about the time that I was retiring, these issues of affordable housing, homelessness, sober living homes were coming to the forefront, and I don't think we've made much of a dent in dealing with those things yet.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Tim. Take us home here. The final question I have, and this is back to the story specifically, but we touched on the topic of the book early on, but could you tell the specific story behind the title, The Mayor Married Who, and what inspired you to use that as the title of the book and just the underlying story behind it?
Well, the title of the book shares the title of the final chapter. And I guess the context would be that probably a month before I walked out the door, finally retired, just when you think you'd either heard it all, seen it all, or done it all, we were faced with one of those curveballs that you never expect when you walk in the door at 8 o'clock in the morning. My longtime executive assistant came rushing into the office saying, "We have a problem." And what's the problem? Well, the mayor married a woman and she can't get the marriage certificate. And I go, "What do you mean the mayor married a woman? He's already married." And her response was, "No, he didn't actually marry the woman. He officiated at the marriage of a woman and her fiance and never returned the signed marriage certificate." My first reaction was, "Can the mayor actually officiate a marriage ceremony?" She goes, "Well, I don't know. I thought maybe you would." So I went down to the city attorney's office and said, "Did the mayor ask you if he was legally authorized to perform a marriage ceremony?" And the quick, rather gruff answer was, "Yeah, and I told him that he couldn't. I gave him some paperwork to that effect." So I go, "Okay, great." Went back to my office, called the mother of the bride, who was the one making the inquiry, and I said, "Did the mayor tell you that he could actually officiate your daughter's marriage?" And she said, "Yes, he told me that he could, and he actually gave me some paperwork from the city attorney." And I said, "Well, I think that might be the paperwork the city attorney gave the mayor to clearly indicate he could not officiate a marriage ceremony." Then there's the pause, and she goes, "Don't tell me they're not legally married." And I said, "They are not." The import of this was that her daughter had married a gentleman in the military who was about to be deployed to Afghanistan, and without a proper marriage certificate, there was concern that if something happened to him, she would not get the spousal benefits that she was entitled to. So on the fly, we contacted the County of Orange, got to the department that performs civil wedding ceremonies, explained our predicament, and they basically said, "If you can get the bride and the groom to the Hall of Administration by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, we will put them first in line for a civil ceremony. We'll issue a new marriage certificate and we'll waive the licensing fees." So we got back to the mom. The bride and groom showed up in downtown Santa Ana, California, the next day. They were legally married. That afternoon, he deployed, and that was a kind of an interesting end to a 40-year career where I think we always viewed ourselves as problem solvers, and this was the last opportunity to create a good ending for a bride and a groom and a mom that were in something of a predicament beyond their control.
You saved the day, Tim. You saved the day. And it's a catchy book title too. It caught my eye, and which led us kind of to our initial discussion. So really, really neat story. And honestly, thanks for sharing that and save the day. With that, Tim, thanks so much for jumping on. I appreciate it. Again, I could sit here and talk stories with you all day. So I appreciate you sharing a few of those important ones that we talked about. And for those listening, the book again is called "The Mayor Married Who" by Tim Casey. You can easily find it on Amazon in paperback or Kindle. Please check it out if you're interested in the book. There's a lot of great stories we didn't cover today, but certainly a lot of key takeaways from a very long career in city management. Again, Tim, thank you for your service. Thanks for everything you do. Thank you for your mentorship and your advising role that you're in today. And I know you make a big impact on a lot of different up and coming and existing city manager and leaders in local government. So again, thank you for being here, Tim.
Thank you, Brendan. It's been a pleasure.
For our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of the Local Government Insights podcast, Modernizing Government Leadership. Please stay tuned for more local government news and insights to come. We look forward to having you next time.